All right, everyone. Today we're going to just do a short lecture on something that I don't necessarily feel that Strayer covers super well in this chapter, but is definitely one of the land-based empires that we are going to be associating and kind of working pretty heavily with in this early modern era of time period 4, which is the Russian Empire. We've been talking for a little while now about how Russia was noticeably absent from much of the early part of our course, but started to make an appearance with the rise of the Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire, and slowly by 14, a little after 1450, right at the beginning of time period 4, we start to see a Russian state start to emerge. And so let's look at the story of how that happened and how it fits in with the other empires of the early modern era. So, how did the Russian state arise? And the beginning of this story begins with something we've already talked about, which was the Mongols, right? We know that around 1500, maybe the late 1400s, a small Russian city-state began to emerge around the city of Moscow. Now, Moscow and the origins of Mongols, or and the origin of Moscow, begins with the story of the Mongols, right? We know that the Mongols laid the smackdown on the previous Russian cultural epicenter of the Kievan Rus, the Russians, in Kiev, right? And then when Kiev was sort of demolished and burned by the Mongols, we saw a migration of Russian power and wealth and kind of um, I don't know, what do you want to say, action to the city far to the north, which was Moscow. Um, Moscow did kind of the classic city state story, which is as they grew more powerful, as they grew richer, they began to look at neighboring cities and conquer them, right? And slowly but surely, we see a city state become a state, which grows into an empire. Um, and this journey from small Muscovite or Moscow city-state into empire lasted about 3 centuries, and the resulting product was giant. Um, Now, the expansion that the Russians mostly embarked on was to the south and the east, which makes sense because if you close your eyes geographically and you think what's to the west, that's Europe, right? And a lot of European states by the 1500s had already really started to kind of coalesce, and so moving and expanding west was infinitely more difficult than moving to the open lands of the east, of Siberia and the steppe regions with the fading pastoral nomads, right? And so they moved south and east, largely, at least initially, to give them a cushion, right? To give them land to buffer them between, their capital city of Moscow and the kind of the always threatening pastoral nomads who had pestered and kind of ultimately killed the Rus for centuries prior. Um, and the lands way further to the east and north, the lands in Siberia, was largely driven by money, by mercantilism, the same sort of philosophy that drove the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the French and the Dutch, which is this belief that the more money you had, the more powerful you were. And Siberia was resource rich with wood. And then as the earth grew colder, around 16 and 1700. We're going to talk about that later. It's the Little Ice Age. The furs of the animals of Siberia became especially valuable. Okay, so now let's examine the kind of the same story that we're looking at with the Spanish in North America and in Central America, um, and the Portuguese in Brazil, which is how did these expansion of this major early modern empire affect the peoples that they kind of colonize, that they move in. Now, we know, and I've already kind of said this, why did pastoral nomads fade? It's because China and Russia grew more powerful. But China and Russia's, growth in power was directly related to their access to technology, which was modern weapons. And so the modern weapons that the Russians were getting coming out of Europe made conquering possible. And they embarked on a conquer of peoples in first initially in nearby city states and kind of then pastoral peoples of the steppes, and defeated peoples were asked to swear allegiance to the Tsar and then pay tribute, which is something we've heard before. Now, the word Tsar has interesting origins coming out of the Byzantine Empire, which came out of the Greeks, um, which was Tsar is Caesar, um, and Caesar means emperor, so kind of a direct link to the early Roman and Greeks before them. And so, this movement into the very rural and very isolated lands of Siberia, especially, which were largely populated by still pastoral, or not pastoral, well, pastoralists, and hunting and gathering peoples, reindeer herders and the like. This conquest brought pretty much the same result as the Spanish and Portuguese into North America, which was devastating epidemics. These areas were very remote, and the people that lived in them had not developed immunity to the Afro-Eurasian diseases that was so common throughout Europe, Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. And so, conquest is infinitely easier when you are killing all of the people who live there, not necessarily at the point of your musket or sword, but at, your sneeze. They had no immunity to smallpox and measles. Um, this conquest also has another similarity um, with the Spanish and Portuguese, which again maybe you're sensing a burgeoning comparative essay coming, um, which was the religious pressures that also existed. Right, we know that the Spanish were heavily motivated to convert conquered natives to Catholicism, and kind of packing that crusading spirit of a couple hundred years earlier. And the same thing happened in the Russian Empire. There was a pretty significant pressure to convert the natives of Siberia to Christianity. Only this time we're talking about Orthodox Christianity because that's Russia, right? Remember, the Byzantines were Orthodox Christianity, and so were the Russians. Um, there was some tolerance to Islamic subjects. We're going to look at some of these kind of more Enlightenment figures down the line, like Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. Um, and then as they kind of wiped through the peoples that had lived in the Siberian and steppe lands before, as they're dying off, um, there was a massive resettlement plan. Again, very similar to the Americas, which is we need to get a lot of Russian people into these new lands in order to subdue them, in order to bring them into our empire, in order to, tap the resources that exist there. Um, very shortly, these new Russians that had been brought into this area outnumbered the native populations in Siberia. Because Siberians, like the native peoples, died because of disease and were defeated in battle, and so there wasn't a lot left by that point. There was also kind of a discouragement of traditional land practices, that pastoralism of the steppes, the reindeer herding, the horse herds and maintenance, and the cattle herds of the steppes, in favor of agriculture. And ultimately, what followed was a purposeful spreading of Russian culture that we are going to refer to as Russification, or the people were Russified, meaning basically made Russian. Right? They were taught the Cyrillic alphabet. They were taught the Russian language. They were steeped in Russian traditions of farming. And they were, for all intents and purposes, converted culturally. Here we have a original painting, actually, of the people on the right. You can see the pastoral um, sort of uh, furs and headdresses, and the peoples on the left would have been the Russians or the Rus. And we have oil pipeline in the picture at the bottom right, which is the resources of Siberia. And the last question here is, how did the Russian Empire affect the history of Russian society? So how did the creation of this empire affect the history of Russian society? Okay, so first, we know that expansion diluted the Russian population, at least initially, and that Russians were being spread over truly vast distances. I mean, when you look at Russia on the map today, it's hands down the biggest country in the world. And so when you rewind 500-600 years and you think, okay, we have to spread the lands, the peoples around Moscow and the lands, or the people in the lands of Eastern Europe, we have to kind of disperse them over all of Siberia and the steppe region. Um, but they got access as a result to incredibly rich lands. As I said, furs previously, but then we have minerals and all the gold coming out of Siberia and precious gems and metals made Russia a great power by the 18th century. They were pulling out basically money directly out of the ground, moving it into traditional trading corridors, and greatly, greatly profiting. Um, and interestingly, as we see Russia on a map, I don't know if how many of you have ever thought, why isn't there a North Asia? And then you say, oh wait, North Asia would be Russia. Is that Russia sits in a geographically really interesting place. Culturally, linguistically, race and ethnicity, they're far more in common with Europe, yet they are an Asian power as well. Um, and their relationships with China and Korea and kind of these steppe nations that develop later, basically had them forcibly interacting not just in European cultural ways, but also Asian as well. Um, and this sort of gave rise to this long-term Russian identity problem, which, as basically, if you look at Russia on a map, look at who's around it, and you think, oh God, like that's a rough way to grow up, right? The Russian state emerged in a geographic reality where their neighbors were the Islamic states of the Middle East, India, China, and the all of those countries and states in Europe, Germany, or the German states, and whatever. And so when you think about that, you think, wow, they were literally surrounded by all of the world's great military powers for nearly its entire existence. And so this kind of sort of gave rise to a cultural reality where Russia was heavily supportive of kind of this militarized state and toughness, right? Where you had to be tough to survive, not just because the weather is cold as crap, but because if you are not tough, China's going to conquer you, right? India is going to move north. The Islamic, peoples of the Middle East will move north, right? The peoples of Western Europe will move east. And so this, over many centuries sort of gave rise to this tradition of autocratic rule, of supporting strong dictators and saying this is what we need to survive. And this carries forward to today, where the Russian people, even though the support is not universal and he is a controversial figure in Russia today, Vladimir Putin sort of carries on this autocratic tradition, right? Where the Russian society generally looks favorably on tough guys, right? Because tough guys is what it took to survive. Um, and so, even as we've looked at a lot of similarities between kind of the colonization of the Americas, right, in terms of disease and religion, we also see some pretty clear differences emerging too, where the colonization of the lands of Siberia was not exactly the same, right? This was conquest of territories that the peoples of the Russian state to the west had interacted with, right? When they moved into Siberia, these were not brand new peoples. It was like, well, we've kind of know you, but now we're taking you over. Um, and we see that this conquest and this expansion, this development of an empire, was also done at the exact same time as the development of the Russian state. It wasn't like the Russian state developed for centuries and then finally turned to conquest. They were conquering at the same time the Russian state was emerging. And if we want to look at Russia as an empire, we would actually track it as a very long-lasting empire, right? That was born in the late 1400s, the late 15th century, and carried all the way to 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was pretty clearly a Russian empire. So that's it for today. Go ahead and attach your notes to the packet, and happy, what is it, Thursday? Tomorrow you'll have your quiz.